Good morning. We return again today to the covenant that God made with Abram, or Abraham as he became known, as God changed his name. Because sure enough, after the visit of the three visitors to Abram, a year later, Sarai conceived and bore a son, called him Isaac, the name that God had given him way in the past, before there was any sign that she would ever bear children. But God wasn't finished with Abraham yet. He was still going to push him, still going to ask of him, because as the child grew, he probably grew to about the age until he was about 20 years of age. See, a lot of the stories that we are told in Sunday school see Abram dealing with a very young child, but he wasn't. Isaac was about 20 years old. And God came to Abraham again and said, "Now, I want you to really trust me. I want you to sacrifice Isaac." See, didn't make sense, did it? Didn't make sense. Abraham had been waiting all these years for the birth of this child. He had trusted God over and over again when God had spoken to him. He had waited for the birth of this child and believed in the birth of this child. When God had changed his name from Abram to Abraham, from exalted father to exalted father of a multitude, he had believed God. He had trusted him. And eventually the child had been born. And now the child was growing strong. Suddenly, Abraham could see that this was a possibility. Here was the way forward. And now God says to him, "Right, now I'm going to push you. I want you to sacrifice Isaac." The faith of this man is beyond all understanding. Because he took some servants, and he took his son Isaac, and he set out to the place that God had told him of. Now we know where that place was. It was just outside of Jerusalem. It was on the top of the hill. It was the same place that one day Jesus himself would be crucified. They get to the bottom of the hill, probably very near to Jerusalem itself. And Abram says to his servants, "You wait here," he says. And then he says something interesting. He says, "My son and I are going up on the mountain to offer sacrifice." And then he says, "And then we will come back to you." He's going off to offer sacrifice. But then he says, "We will come back to you." Why did he say we? See, God knew that Abraham knew that God had promised him that his descendants would come through Isaac. And now God was asking him to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham knew that even though he sacrificed Isaac, God would have to resurrect him, because God's promises could not fail. That's the point. God's promises could not fail. And it's something you and I, as we go forward in faith, have got to get hold of as well. Even when things seem to be impossible, as they had seemed impossible to Abraham over all these years, and especially at this moment, God's promises cannot fail. They cannot fail. The covenant cannot be set aside. So Abraham goes with Isaac, and Isaac says to him, he says, "Father," he said, "we've got the wood for the fire, we've got everything ready. Where's the sacrifice?" And Abraham says to his son, he says, "God himself will provide the sacrifice." Yes, he would. One day God himself would provide the sacrifice the sacrifice of Jesus at that same point for the sins of the world. But Abraham takes his son up onto the mountain to the place called Golgotha at the top. And there he builds his altar. He lays the wood on the altar. I wonder what Isaac was thinking at this time. But he's a dutiful son. And he allows his father to bind him and lay him on the altar. And then Abraham takes the knife. He's about to actually kill his son when God suddenly calls out and says, "Stop. Now I know, without any doubt, that your faith is strong enough. You are going to be the father of all those who believe by faith." Release the boy. And he points out to him a ram with his head caught in thorns. And one day, Jesus, his head crowned with thorns, would die at that very same place. God had stepped in. God's promises were being fulfilled. Amen.